Hi Y12, Miss Thika here. I hope you're all alright and you are managing to keep safe and healthy and sane still from last time I spoke to you. This is a second lesson that I'm going to be putting on YouTube, and hopefully, if I just give it a test, fingers crossed that this one won't be as disastrous as the first one and you will actually be able to see the slides as I talk over them this time, and we'll see a little bit of progress from me technology wise. So today we are thinking about the trial and execution of Charles I. Last lesson you looked over some of the sources with regards to the attempts to reach a settlement with him. Now we are going to be thinking about the repercussions of Charles's failure in the Second Civil War, his trial, who put him on trial, how they put him on trial, and the impact of that. So you're going to get off me today a YouTube lesson for content. However, I will also I should have, if you are listening to this right now, you should also have got this from me, information that you must read before you watch the video. So literally the first thing I'm going to talk about in the video is this reading. It's quite in-depth because even though I've put it all on one Word document, it is actually about 3 separate topics that kind of mingle in together. The Treaty of Newport, the Army Remonstrance, and Pride's Purge. You are not really going to get what I'm talking about throughout a lot of this YouTube lesson if you haven't read that, so please make sure you do it now. I don't want you to just skim read it because it is quite dense. I would like you to take your time reading it, and I would like you to make notes separately about these 3 things for me, please. Then I should also have sent you, it feels a bit weird talking about myself in like the future, I should also have sent you a link to a short clip which shows the execution of Charles I. I have not yet been able to figure out how to embed different YouTube videos so it would just pop up to show you. I'm not quite that technologically savvy. So I'll have to just send it separately. So when we get to that in the lesson, I'll say, right, pause me now and watch this video, and then there are some tasks that I want you to do from that separate YouTube video. I'm hoping all of this makes sense. It should make sense as we work our way through it, but hey ho, let's see how we get on. Okay. So, as I've said, today we are thinking about the build-up to the trial and the execution of King Charles in January 1649. So, by now, she says, touch wood, you should have read the information that I sent you via email about the Treaty of Newport, the Army Remonstrance and Pride's Purge. If you haven't read it yet and you're trying to be cheeky to see if you can get away with not reading it, don't read it now, please. So what we see during this time period after Charles's defeat in the Second Civil War and the build-up to the trial and execution is this is a period of great social, political and religious turmoil. Charles has not only been defeated in one civil war, he's been defeated in 2, and that's a really crucial thing to understand because that really changes the situation. After Charles's defeat in the First Civil War, as we saw with lessons before we broke up, the different political groups very much aimed to reach a compromise. They wanted to reach a settlement, an understanding with Charles so that they could move forward together. I think a common misconception is that as soon as the First Civil War was over, that was it. Everyone just wanted to see Charles's head on a spike. That's not the case. A vast majority of people, be that people from the parliaments, people from the army, or just you general bog standard ordinary people, they wanted to see Charles on the throne. He is the king. But people wanted to arrange a settlement with him that would ensure that nothing like this could happen again. In order to do that, they needed to limit some of his powers. We know that Charles did not agree to that. He wouldn't accept the settlements offered to him by Parliament and by the army. And he waged a second civil war on his own people by accepting the terms of the engagement with Scottish Presbyterians, which kick-started the short second civil war. That is a major game changer. Once Charles is defeated in the second civil war, then people very much start to change their attitude towards him. However, yes, he's a defeated man in the sense of he's lost the war, but he's not dead. So the king is still alive. So what do you do with somebody that clearly does not and is not willing to negotiate? He is the head of the state and he is not dead. He's not going anywhere. You can't ship him abroad because he could potentially get himself foreign aid and come back even stronger and retake his throne that way. You can't get rid of him in a bloody kind of manner, like sort of slit his throat in secret and dump his body in the Thames or anything like that, because people want to see what is happening with their monarch and there will be mass outcry if that happens. But he's also proved that you can't keep him in prison because he was constantly plotting and scheming and escaping prison when they held him in the first time. So the situation has very much changed. What on earth are they going to do with this king and with this man that seemingly won't be negotiated with? So in the first part of your reading, you should have come across the Treaty of Newport. So this was highly controversial, particularly from radical elements within the New Model Army. At this point, further settlement with the king to them is infutile. Well, infutile is probably the wrong word. To them, it's almost... to them, it feels like a bit of a slap in the face. What have they fought him for if Parliament is just going to try and reach a settlement with him? They see it as a stab in the back. They no longer want to reach any form of settlement with the king. The opposite, they want to put him on trial and they want to hold him to account for what he's done. And we know that because we see quite a strong turn in the language that the New Model Army, elements of the New Model Army, start to use against Charles. From this period, they don't refer to him as king or majesty. They refer to him as Charles Stuart, which is his formal name, or they refer to him as just that man of blood, which might not feel like something particularly that major to us, but during this period, that was a great show as to what they thought and felt about him during this time. It's showing that they no longer recognise him as their monarch and their leader. Instead, they see him as just a regular guy, a man of blood like me or you. And by calling him Charles Stuart, that kind of removes the element of divine right from him. It removes this idea that he is specially protected by God, and instead it suggests that actually he is just a regular man, and if an ordinary man had done the things that he had done, then he would be taken to court and he would be tried. So why can't we do the same for Charles Stuart, that man of blood? So when the Treaty of Newport was being formalised and the New Model Army was becoming particularly anxious about the fact that Charles might essentially just be restored to the throne fully, we see a breakaway within the army as they become more radical and they feel like their voice should be heard more than ever before, because effectively they're the ones that has defeated him not once now but twice. This is where we start to see radical elements within the army taking formal action. So remember, I mentioned this quite a lot. Common misconception that Cromwell is the commander of the New Model Army at this point. He's not. He's second in command. The head of the New Model Army is Lord Fairfax. When we start to see a shift towards putting Charles on trial, this is where we start to see the new model army becoming very fragmented, very divided. Fairfax does not want to see Charles treated like an ordinary person. He wants this to be done very legally, very properly, through negotiations over a long period of time. He doesn't want it to be rushed and emotional. Whereas other radical sections of the army, we're talking people like Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, he becomes more radical and more vocal. And it's within these meetings here, again, you should have come across this in your reading, where we start to see disputes across the army as to how to move forward. Radical sections led by Henry Ireton are suggesting that the current Parliament is not fit because the vast majority of MPs that are sitting in Parliament are moderates and they want to negotiate with Charles, and in the eyes of the army they can't allow that to happen. So there are calls that all of Parliament, the entire government, should be closed, that they should completely sack all of the current MPs. Again, Fairfax is very conscious of this. He wants this to be done legally, and he knows that effectively if all of Parliament is forcibly dissolved through army rule, that will lead them in a very precarious situation legally. It's suggested then that if a full closure could not be accepted, that instead maybe a partial purge should take place. So if you purge something, that means you get rid of it. I'm sure a few of you have probably seen the horror films at some point. You can have a regular purge where you sack a certain amount of people to start afresh, or you can have a bloody purge where people are killed. And what we see is the army suggests that actually they should form a list of MPs that are going to be loyal to their cause. So this is not going to include moderate MPs that think that they should reach a settlement with Charles. They're not going to make it on the list. They're not allowed. Instead, they want the minority members of MPs that are more radical in their thinking, that are going to adopt to the army's way of thinking in terms of how this should progress. So they only want MPs to sit in the Commons if they know that they will be keen to see Charles put on trial during this point. So we're very much split into several different fragments here. We've got some moderates that want to continue a settlement with Charles. We've got some fragments within the army in terms of radical and more moderation there. And we've also got fragments in terms of how to divide Parliament, some wanting to see a complete dissolve and others wanting to see a partial purge. We do, and again, I'm hoping you've read this, we do see Pride's Purge take place in December 1648, and that essentially gives birth to the Parliament that we're able to finally put Charles on trial. So, give me 1 second, because I think my laptop is about to die, and I have to plug it in. Right, I'm back. Again, with your reading, which you should have read, if you haven't, make sure you get it done, we see the formation of something known as the Rump Parliament. So, if we jump back now, several years during the Bishops' Wars, or just before the outbreaks of the Bishops' Wars, we know that Charles was effectively ruling alone during his 11-year tyranny. When the Bishops' War breaks out, we see the summoning of two parliaments. The Short Parliament, called the Short Parliament because it only sat for 3 weeks, to which Charles dissolved, and then the formation of the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament, headed initially by John Pym. These are some of the key words and the key people we've not talked about for a while. that was the Parliament that effectively was able to resist Charles and formed the basis of the civil wars. The Long Parliament has continued, but as we've just seen, the army no longer wants the Long Parliament to continue because it's full of moderates. So Henry Ireton, Lord Fairfax, knows nothing about this. Ireton creates a list of MPs that they deem good enough to form a new parliament. Sorry, not a new army. A new parliament that will be able to put Charles on trial. So this new parliament is called the Rump Parliament. So this name was given to the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament was cut short, and this is just the Rump. This is the tiny part of the Long Parliament that's left sitting. So the Rump Parliament was given its name after Pride's Purge of December 1648, in which those MPs who sought a negotiated settlement with the king were forcibly expelled by the new model army. So we are seeing direct military intervention here. They have culled, not bloodily, we don't see any bloodshed, but they have effectively dismissed those MPs that they know wanted to reach a negotiated settlement with Charles, and they've only allowed MPs that they know they can mould, MPs that they know will try Charles, to come and regain their seat in the Commons. The Rump regarded itself as a lawful parliament of the Commonwealth of England. However, just because they deem themselves lawful doesn't mean that they are lawful. And really, they're not lawful. And that is essential, because that sticks with them for many, many years to come after the events that are about to follow. And you can tell, really, with the name The Rump, it became sort of their enduring nickname, because essentially they were the arse end of Parliament. They are the rump, the last little bit, the last chunk. They're not the whole body, they're just a certain part of it, a radical part of it that's been given permission by the army to sit. The Rump Parliament consisted of around 80 MPs. One of its first actions was to set up a High Court of Justice. This was specially convened for the sole purpose of trying Charles I. So, the Long Parliament is gone. We've now got the Rump. So, what's holding them back? Well, actually, it's not as easy as that. So even though you will have seen with your reading that on the 6th of December in 1648, Colonel Pride did successfully manage to forcibly turn away those radical members of Parliament, but that doesn't mean that everything is going to go smooth sailing. There are still some major difficulties here in terms of how do you try a king? Can you try a king? It's never been done before. So what were some of the main concerns? The Purge, even though it was successful, it still did not necessarily mean that radicals would get their way. We were still technically somewhat a democracy. This was still going through the Commons. It would still rely on a voting system. Charles's attitude was still a major sticking point during this time. He very much did not accept the legality of the Rump Parliament, and that held back progress, and it was seen as obstructing God's will, God's providence to allow this to happen. The trial must be public. So as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just a case of getting rid of Charles on the sly, killing him quietly in his chamber in the middle of the night or something. This would have to be as public as physically possible to avoid any form of discrepancies regarding Charles's guilt. This had to be seen as legal, even though technically it's not really legal. They have to dress it as though it is. They don't want people to claim that Charles has been hard done by in this situation. The outcome was still really uncertain. In a situation where Charles would be found not guilty, well, then what would you do? a settlement would be practically impossible during this time period. Well, it was practically impossible even before this period. We know that during the first, after the first Civil War, when Charles left, he still wouldn't reach a settlement. So if he's found not guilty in this situation, how on earth are they going to settle with him then? But if found guilty, then what are they going to do? They still haven't quite decided what the outcome is going to be. Are they actually going to go ahead and kill the king? Because really, even though they're at the trial of Charles, that doesn't mean that everybody there has still fully accepted the fact that Charles's head might roll. So if he is found guilty, what the hell do you do with him? Republicanism during this point as well is only favoured by a small minority. So we're not particularly in a position where people want to kill Charles because they want to kill monarchy as a whole. Some members of the Rump claimed that actually having a king isn't the problem, it's just this king that they don't like. So should we get rid of Charles and replace him with someone else? That someone else was potentially going to be one of his sons. That was something that was debated for a short period of time. But again, no one was really sure. So even though the Rump has been formed and the trial has started, there are still several major grey areas that no one really knew what the answer to them was, because nothing like this had ever happened before. Okay, so I should have sent you a link via email to a clip of Charles's execution from the film Cromwell. What I want you to do is I want you to watch it, and then I want you to make notes about the following questions for me, please. So how do the reactions of the executions compare in the clip? So for example, have a close look at parliamentarians. How are they behaving? What about the crowd? How do you think Charles is portrayed? And then think about this statement here. The king became most dignified during his final moments. This was crucial if he was going to be seen as a martyr. Do you agree with this statement? So when you watch the clip, do you think that actually this is potentially one of the most dignified moments we've seen of Charles? Is he holding himself really in a graceful manner? Is he doing that deliberately? You know, does he want to be remembered as a martyr? Is it kind of a final slap in the face to Parliament? Or do you think he's just kind of accepted what's happening to him? So if you've watch that clip of the execution, hopefully you've managed to get some of those notes down. So I just want to talk really quickly about these last two elements, the trial itself and then the attitude of Charles during the trial. So we know that the Rump was specially created with the sole purpose of creating the High Court so that they could prosecute Charles. However, in order to do that, as I mentioned previously, they needed to give themselves authority, and they had to give off the impression that they were legal. So in order to give themselves authority, the Commons asserted that they had supreme power in this nation. They claimed that they did not need the King or the House of Lords in order to set up the High Court and in order to put Charles on trial. So they're effectively acting within their own power at this point, which is something that we haven't quite seen before to this level. The Rump stressed that it was acting on behalf of the people of England to represent the will of the people whom the king had offended during the wars. Again, they're using terms like this to make themselves sound like a legal body that is there to protect the ordinary people. But it was probably this claim that backfired the most for them. this bit here. They are there to represent the will of the people. Well, are they really? Are they acting on the will of ordinary people? Is the trial and execution of Charles what the vast majority of people wanted? Generally, no, it wasn't. This perception changes depending on which time period of historian you research, but in terms of modern historians now, it's generally agreed that actually the vast majority of people didn't want to see Charles executed. That's not saying that they didn't want to see him held to account for certain things that he had done, but execution and being held to account are two very different things. So whilst the Rump was telling everybody and anybody who would listen that their sole purpose was to represent the will of the people, actually it seems as though they are representing themselves and they are working hard to get rid of Charles in order to give themselves security. A good indication as to how we know that this wasn't the will of the people, when the charges were read out against Charles, these were often met by screams and by cries from the crowd of ordinary people. Where the trial was held and during the meetings, the commissioners who were drafted in to try Charles had to be protected by army members. Armed guards were everywhere around about the trial to keep the crowd at bay. Several key members of the New Model Army had invested in bulletproof hats because they were convinced that they were going to be assassinated during the trial. So it was a very fraught situation. But again, if the Rump was really acting on the will of the people, then surely they wouldn't need all of this protection from the New Model Army. There wouldn't be riots or protests. There wouldn't be worries that they would be assassinated, because surely the populace and the people, the ordinary people of the area would be in support of what they were doing. But that didn't seem to be the case. Also, another clear indication that divisions were rife during this point is the head of the New Model Army, Lord Fairfax, refused to take part in the trial. He cuts ties. He doesn't cut ties with the army just yet. That comes a little bit later, where he steps down and Cromwell formally replaces him. But he is very aggrieved by what is going on. It seems to sort of hit him personally what's happening. He doesn't want to see Charles on trial, and he certainly does not want to see Charles executed. So he washes his hands of the situation. However, his wife, Lady Fairfax, does attend court on his behalf, and she frequently screamed in protest in the gallery. In fact, it is said that during one particular day, she stood up and she screamed, but people didn't know who she was. So one of the commissioners ordered one of the army soldiers to remove the whore, and when the soldier grabbed her and a scarf fell down to reveal her face, the rest of the gallery realised that it was Lady Fairfax that they just called a whore. And again, that shocked people, that she, who is married to the head of the New Model Army defeated Charles not once but twice. They're now screaming on behalf of Charles and challenging the legality of the Rump and the High Court. So it highlights really well just how divided all these different groups were in society with regards to the trial and certainly the execution of Charles. Was this the right thing to do? Well, it seemed as though many people didn't feel that way. So make sure you get this down in note form for me, please. And this is the last little bit that I'd also like you to make notes from as well, please. So the attitude of Charles during the trial. The attitude and personality of Charles is something that we spend quite a lot of time talking about, really, over the course of this topic, and that's because it really is fundamental in a lot of the events that take place during this time. We know, because we've talked about it before, that Charles was a stubborn man. He seemed to infuriate, whether that's deliberately or not, infuriate those around him. Those that tried to work with him found him difficult. He seemed to overcomplicate situations, often seeming to dig large holes for himself. And that is what, quite honestly, turned a lot of people off from him. However, it's said that during his trial, Charles had a slight shift in his attitude, although it didn't do him any good because he was still executed. But he certainly was seen in a slightly different light. So when his trial opened, Charles was charged with subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of the nation and maliciously making war on Parliament and the people of England. They had to take this further, though, because they had to actually charge him with a crime. So, in a reversal of the traditional definition, Parliament declared that Charles was guilty for treason, and that it was treasonous for a king to wage war upon his own subjects. So, a total of 135 commissioners were effectively asked to come and sit and judge Charles. But, as you can imagine, a lot of them were very anxious about doing this. A lot of people might perhaps have been keen to verbally give their opinion, but when it came to actually showing their face in public and putting pen to paper and writing their signature and being accountable for the decisions made, a lot of them didn't want to do it. So out of those 135, 50 of those commissioners point blank refused to participate, and then as the days grew closer and closer to the trial starting, several more withdrew and just dropped out, and some of them didn't even turn up on the day. So again, you can see there's a lot of apprehension here. It's said that throughout the trial, Charles had a quiet dignity. He spoke well, although he didn't speak much. That seemed to be, although he wasn't allowed any form of counsel, so he wasn't allowed a lawyer or anything like that. He decided that that would be the best course of action, to speak when spoken to, but to say very few words, and to constantly challenge the legality of the Rump Parliament. So his quiet dignity very much infuriated the commissioners. Charles point blank refused to answer the charges against him. So whenever any of the commissioners tried to ask him a question or tried to challenge him on his roles throughout the First and Second Civil War, basically his kind of go-to answer would be something along the lines of, I call into question the legality of this council, or I ask by what jurisdiction, sorry, I've lost my tongue there. I call to know by what jurisdiction you bring me here today. It's a clever move by Charles. He knows that a lot of people are questioning the legality of the Rump, and that's exactly what he was doing, day in and day out. Why am I here? Who's brought me here? Can you legally have me here? No, you can't. So even though this is almost typical Charles, it's a little bit more clever from him than we've seen before. And he does hold himself quite well. So he doesn't recognise the jurisdiction of the High Court, and he challenged the basis on which the purged Houses of Commons could claim to represent the people of England. On the 26th of January, the commissioners drafted a sentence condemning Charles as a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy to the Commonwealth of England. Now again, as I said before, whenever they put this to Charles, he refused to answer. Some of the common things he would say were things like, I am your king, I have a trust committed to me by God, I stand more for the liberty of my people here than you do, things along those lines. So he never accepted any form of guilt in the roles that he played in the First and the Second Civil War. But something that seemed to ring quite loudly within the court was the attitude that the commissioners were showing towards Charles. At this point, he is still king. Even though the New Model Army are calling him Charles Stuart, that man of blood, they can call him what they like, he is still the monarch. But as soon as he stepped foot in that courthouse, he wasn't treated that way. And he found that very alarming throughout the several days that this trial took place. So one particularly famous incident occurred when Charles dropped something in the courthouse. At the end of his walking cane was said to have fallen off. He dropped it. So normally Charles would look to the person closest and they would scramble over to pick it up for him. So he did just that. And people stared back at him with blank expression. I'm not picking it up. You're here on trial in court and I don't recognise you as a monarch and a superior person. Charles had to get up from his own seat and go and retrieve the object that he had dropped. And I think that to him sent a really clear message that actually he really isn't in the position that he thought he was. So if you remember me talking about the end of the First Civil War, when the different groups are trying to reach a settlement with him, it is said that Charles was convinced they could do nothing without him because you couldn't have a kingdom without a king. Well, during the trial and in the first few opening days, I think it really dawned on Charles that this was very different now, and actually we could now be looking at a kingdom without a king, a commonwealth, a republic that doesn't have a monarchy or doesn't have this monarch. And even though that dawned on Charles, it didn't really change his attitude. He still continued to fail to give straight answers, and he refused to answer the charges that were brought to him. So the trial progressed. The final session of the trial was held on the 27th of January. John Bradshaw was the leading commissioner. He gave a 40-minute address to the prisoner, that is Charles, and he asserted that even a king was subject to the law, although we know, having looked at several years of Charles, particularly during his early years and during his 11-year personal rule, that Charles often believed that he was above the law. He's getting a shocker now. No, you're not. You're not above the law. He then went on to say that Charles had broken the sacred bond between king and subjects, that he had chosen to do this by making war on his own people, and therefore, by making that decision, he had forfeited the right to their allegiance. So now the regular people of England no longer were Charles's subjects because he had chosen to break that bond with them by waging 2 civil wars upon them. He declared Charles guilty of the charges against him and offered the sentence of death. Charles then asked to speak and he was told that he could not. So even though, as I said here, that Charles really refused to answer any of the questions put forward to him, as soon as the sentence of death was read out, that's when he wanted his voice to be heard. But unfortunately, by that point, it was too late, and he was shocked that he was not allowed to give a closing sentence on this, and he was forcibly led away by soldiers of the New Model Army to await his execution in the following days. So, last thing I would like you to do for me, please. You should all have a copy of your smaller textbook, the Early Stuarts and the English Revolution textbook. In there, pages 132 to 135, at the side of each page, there are really small grey boxes with contemporary sources and questions in them. If you can, give each of those a read and then answer the questions that are in that exercise book that go with it. If for whatever reason you don't have a textbook or you need help, give me a shout, and obviously I've got a copy of this textbook at home as well, so if you don't have one, I can always take pictures of mine and send them to you. Okay, so that's the second lesson done. Hope you enjoyed it. Any issues, please give me a shout, and keep safe, and I'll speak to you again next week.